Welcome to the after lunch session. I'm very pleased to be here. Like you said, Europeana has been an all-time friend, I think, of the IIIF consortium. We're one of the founding members, and I'm very excited to be able to tell you a few things, some musings on what I think will be interesting things to chew on for all of us as a community for the next decade or so. I was talking a little bit to Josh Hedro, and we found that actually we're pretty much in the same space. I took over as Executive Director of Europeana about a year ago, and Josh as well, I think 7 months ago. And both of our organizations are pretty much 10 years old. And what it did for me is that I started to think a bit about, what does that mean to be 10 years old as an organization, which was fueled always by a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of idealism, I would say, very much like IIIF. And what does that mean for me as an executive director in my role in taking this forward into the next decade? So what I'd like to do is to tell you a little bit of the context that I think my organization and perhaps your organizations are in at the moment. In terms of frame of the work that we're all doing. I was just thinking over lunch, there's probably many things that bind us in this room, but I'm quite sure there's one that we all share. That is a passion for how technology can make our culture and our cultural heritage as widely available as possible. Because I'm assuming, like me, you believe that there is an inherent worth, there's value in that. And we're going to explore that a little bit through some of the things that we're doing at Europeana. I'll touch upon some things that we're doing currently with IIIF. And then I'd like to spend most of the time at the end talking to you about a possible scenario for the future, which I call Mirror World. And I'll tell you a little bit about what that means and how the project that we're involved in, Time Machine, could contribute to that and the role of IIIF. So first of all, and this is the European context, and I know many Americans in the room. I think I've talked to half the Getty staff just over lunch. The European context is, I think, at the moment quite favorable to the types of things that we're doing. And I think it is critical that we start formulating and being expressive of really the worth that the work that we're doing and how technology can contribute to the agenda of policymakers who are ultimately funders of the things that we're doing. So last year was an interesting year here in Europe. It was the European Year of Cultural Heritage. Now, you might think, like I did, with some skepticism, yeah, that's the type of lingo you'd expect from the European Commission, but what does that really mean in practice? So one of the things that came out of it that I think was quite positive is that it surfaced cultural heritage and the role it can play in society up to the level of policymakers who actually can pull some strings. And I'm going to show you some numbers. And these numbers are very small letters in what is called the new agenda for culture. So I blew them up really big because I want to impress you with it and myself. So in that new agenda for culture, which is basically the agenda for culture of the European Union for the next 7 years or so, it is stated that we contribute, and this is culture and creative industries lumped together, and I think that it's worthwhile doing that, contributes 4.2% to the EU GDP. Now, most of us in the not-for-profit sector are not so impressed by numbers like that, but I think if you want to play to the agenda of your policymakers, it is really worthwhile understanding this deeply. We contribute 4.2% to all the GDP in Europe, in member states of Europe. Not only that, and this is the thing that I like most, it's a nice little example, we have more employment, 7.8 million people are employed in the cultural and creative sector. And that is by far more than the automotive, manufacturing and chemical industries together in Europe. Now, if you read this literally, then of course you can make two conclusions. One is you need more people to do the same thing in the cultural sector. Be a little bit more efficient, guys. You could also say we're actually in the 21st century now. This is the agenda that Europe should play into. This is where growth might happen. So, not only that, we can also see that during the years 2011-2016, which were difficult years from an economic perspective, this sector grew by 7% compound, where the average was much lower. So we're not only a big sector, we're a growth sector. And probably the most important thing to the agenda of European policymakers and to myself as a father is that our sector contributes as the largest employment of what they call young professionals in Europe, close to 20%. Now, with an average unemployment rate, especially in southern countries in Europe, of close to 40–50%, this is a sector you want to invest in. So what I often like to say is that we need to change the frame that we're operating in. We need to stop talking about words like sustainability. We need to stop talking about support. I mean, that puts you in a position of wanting to be supported, the crutches that you need. Well, actually, this is a sector really worth investing in. So that's just the economic perspective and the employment perspective. Obviously, we're not in that for that. We believe that there is transversal value in making cultural heritage available digitally across the world. And we may call that opportunities for transformation. So what kind of activities can we deploy that not only have transactional impact, but also transformational impact, so that there's both an economic return and a social investment that we're trying to make? And how do we express that in ways that we understand to be valuable and also our paymakers? So for that, we need to look into the agenda for the future for Europe. We've got big challenges in education and scholarship. We've got big challenges in making sure that our cities are not flooded with tourists who are just extracting value instead of regenerating cities. And there's lots of big challenges in terms of social cohesion and identity that I'm sure you're all aware of. So how do we tackle these things? And I'm not saying that we have the answer for that. I'm going to show you two examples of things, our attempts to at least play into that agenda in a useful way. So first of all, Europeana EU is a website. It's built on APIs, it's built on triple stores, but ultimately its value is expressed as a website. We have about 58 million records at the moment from close to 4,000 institutions. At the latest count yesterday, I found out that 63% of that are reusable in some form that is legally, Creative Commons, and so forth. So that, I think, is the value that we bring. We democratize access to culture. We enable other people to do cool things with it. So things we like to hear, and here I'm looking for performance indicators, are things like this from the Director of Collections Management in Finland at the Finnish National Gallery. They thank Europeana for accelerating discussions. I think that's the type of thing that I'm looking for in my teams in order to stimulate. So the result of that intervention, of that discussion that we've had, is that the Finnish National Gallery brought 10,000 objects from a closed CC license to CC0, greatly enabling very cool things to happen on the Europeana website and elsewhere. So that makes me happy. So that, of course, is an enabling function that we have. We sometimes also verge into deeper forms of intervention. Not always successfully, but I think it is our duty to at least try to make these things happen. So for example, we've tried to tackle the subject of migration. So migration being an incredibly important topic at the moment. I'm not a political organization. I have personal views on things, but I don't think Europeana's role is to say yes or no against or for migration. But I do think what our role is to make sure that we can contribute to the policy debates and the national debates by showing what migration has contributed to over the past centuries. So we invited, in this case, over 20 countries, in 20 places in Europe, we invited people to share their stories and bring an artifact that reminded them of that story that was related to migration. And you'll see that there's a wide variety of people. And what I hoped that it achieved is that it's changed a few things in their perception of migration. So I won't go to a lot of detail here. We do impact assessments on that. And one of the things we found is that a lot of people who did contribute actually had higher levels of self-esteem about their migration story. It was not something that they talked about a lot before, and now they feel proud about having that. And I think pride, self-esteem are probably the types of things that we need to show more of in order to build that social cohesion that we're so looking after. So this is just a little taster. One of the things that we're trying to do then, I think our community at large needs to keep investing in. So, the team at Europeana says, the party people at Europeana at the Christmas party, what's our role in this? How do we make that happen? What do I do on a day-to-day basis to make these wonderful things happen? So those are the things that we're investigating. So I'm just showing you this picture because it tells you a little bit about the structure of my organization. We're a networked organization. We have at Europeana Foundation about 55 people working, but the power of it is the network. Just like with IIIF, we have a network of about 2,000 people, part of an association, and know some of you are part of that, and that is where we design new features. That's where we design new formats and frameworks to make things work. We also have an aggregators forum. Those are our content partners that interface with close to 4,000 museums, libraries, and archives across Europe. And making that gel, that is how I think we can make things scalable, as Josh and I were exchanging some thoughts on. That is where the power is. So what are we doing on a day-to-day basis? In our business plan 2019, we identified that we probably want to be active on what we call 3 horizons of innovation. It's a model I stole from McKinsey, and I think it worked pretty well for me. It's a model based on the idea that a strong organization that keeps on growing, of course this comes from the business world, but applies as much to us, I think, understands that it needs to keep investing in its core service so that it becomes really strong and really powerful. But if you're not at the same time also investing in small innovations to the core and ultimately also in new and innovative activities that we call Horizon 3, you'll be out of business really soon. And that's a risk that all of our organizations are facing. So all of that, and I think that is really at the core of what we're doing, and that is what joins Europeana at the hip with IIIF, is that we're building everything on interoperability. Open standards that work together will make it work across the globe and will make that powerful vision of everything digitized, everything interlinked possible. So we very much believe in IIIF. It helps the people we work with, the GLAMs in Europe, keep control, provenance, attribution, and increase their visibility. Those are all things that we need to apply. In our, let's call it Horizon 1, the core service, it means that if you do a search on Europeana, in this case on a Swedish artist from early 19th century, after you're done with your search and you figured out what image you would like to use, what color it needs to be, how reusable it should be, you're able to click on it and zoom on it, as we've seen many times before in the examples this morning. We currently have about 5 million objects that work this way. Obviously, it needs an implementation both at source and at Europeana in order to work. So we're advocating for all of our institutions to apply this. We've adapted our data ingestion to recognize and specifically process IIIF resources, and we've adapted our data model EDM in order to work with this. So how are we innovating? We are basing our new structure of the website very much on the concept of entities. So entities connect various types of work through words that are mapped against thesauri and other maps. And in order to make that interlinking work, we also create new forms of interactivity through 3D, and we're adapting our EDM model in order to deal with that. And the biggest thing that we've changed so far is in our newspapers collections. We have probably the biggest newspaper collection in Europe at the moment that is digitized full text. It's the only full text thing that we have at the moment. And we're investigating implementing the audiovisual content viewer in Europeana, so I think doing that will dramatically expand the impact of IIIF in our network. So, what does that mean for the real innovation? I think when you're 10 years old, you're at risk of becoming as good as you think the funding allows you to. But I think the vision for what we're trying to do is so much bigger. If you think about the amount of works that are currently digitized, we're only scratching the surface. We're about 20%, we estimate, in Europe in all the material digitized. So of all the things that over the past 10,000 years have been written up, have been photographed, have been painted, how much of that can we actually currently, when there's a convergence of supercomputing, parallel computing power, big data, and stronger algorithms, how much of those libraries can we actually turn from their current interaction format into something that is digitally and machine readable? So, when you think about that, and we call that perhaps big data from the past, how much of that will we be able to use into what is inevitably becoming a digitally transformed society, where cities are going to have a digital overlay, where cars will be self-running, where cameras will be ubiquitous and ever-present. And everything will be interlinked and the whole world will have a machine-readable interface. What kind of world do we want that to transform into? And how can we use our cultural heritage to make that an interesting world where we can still try to solve some of the agenda points that I was mentioning earlier? So, in order to grasp that and see what kind of impacts that we can expect from such a world, I want to take you into an article that blew my mind when I first read it. It's based on a book from 1983 by a gentleman called Ted Williams, who first coined the concept mirror world. And then it was picked up by one of my favorite authors, Kevin Kelly, from Wired magazine. So the concept of mirror world is explained in an article from the March edition of Wired, and I'm going to read you, very old school, a couple of paragraphs from it. The mirror world doesn't yet fully exist, but it is coming. Every day soon, every place and thing in the real world, every street, lamppost, building and room, will have its full-size digital twin in the mirror world. For now, only tiny patches of the mirror world are available through AR headsets. But piece by piece, these virtual fragments are being stitched together to form a shared, persistent place that will parallel the real world. Google Earth has long offered a hint of what this mirror world will look like. It's already under construction, deep in the research lab of tech companies around the world, mostly in Stanford, of course. Deep in those research labs, scientists and engineers are racing to construct virtual places that overlay actual places. Crucially, this is the part I really like, crucially, these emerging digital landscapes will feel real. They'll exhibit what landscape architects call placeness. The street view images in Google Maps are just facades, flat images hinged together. But in the mirror world, a virtual building will have volume, a virtual chair will exhibit chairness, and a virtual street will have layers of textures, gaps, and intrusions that all convey a sense of street. So basically, a mirror world is a marked up world. It's an environment that we're walking around in, like here in Göttingen, that we'll be able to interface with through markups. At first, the mirror world will appear to us as a high-resolution stratum of information overlaying the real world. We might see a virtual name tag hovering in front of people we previously met. It's kind of useful for me, I forget names a lot. We might see a virtual name tag hovering around of people we previously met. Perhaps a blue arrow showing us the right place to turn a corner, or helpful annotations anchored to places of interest. Time is a dimension in the mirror world that can be adjusted. Unlike the real world, but very much like the world of software apps, you will be able to scroll back. History will be a verb. With a swipe of your hand, you'll be able to go back in time at any location and see what came before. You will be able to lay a reconstructed 19th century view right over present reality. Now that, at heart, is the essence of the Time Machine project that we are part of in a consortium of about 30 partners at the moment, and that is, I think, one of the most exciting things that are happening here in Europe at the moment. And basically, we're trying to create that 4D layer on the mirror world that will be present. So I'm going to take you through some ideas that are floating at the moment. This is still very much work in progress in terms of what do you need in order to make that world happen? And what is the role of IIIF in supporting that? So in terms of basic architecture, you first need to think about what are the outputs that you can think are valuable to the people and the businesses around the world. So we have in mind that scholars will be able to create computational interpretations, for example, on social mobility in cities that are completely new and totally not happened before. We think that city planners will be able to use this type of information to more holistically reconstruct, not only reconstruct, but also predict what kind of cities we will be living in and how that should interface with the past. And we believe that there's huge room for creative industries of all kinds to create smart applications so that cities will be able to attract a different type of tourism, not the one that is extractive, but the one that regenerates value into the cities that we live in. So that's sort of the dream that we are working against. So what kind of value chain supports that? And this is a first attempt to draw that for you. It's quite complex stuff, so I use drawers to help us conduct conversations in our consortium. So if on the left are the local time machines, and we already have about 10 in place. We have in Amsterdam, in Budapest, in Portugal. We have cities who are buying into this concept and saying, yes, we want to be a local time machine. And they're investing themselves already, and we're basically asking for co-funding from the European Union in order to support the basic infrastructure around it. So we essentially see three layers. We see that's the platform in the middle. We see a big R&D effort that needs to happen through the computer sciences departments in Europe and the world. It's open for everyone in order to create a number of smart solutions. We see on the right-hand side an infrastructure emerging, perhaps built on Europeana, perhaps built on frameworks developed already by IIIF, that supports the development of big data of the past, as we start to call it. So there are 5 key components that we think will be relevant in that space. We haven't fleshed it out completely, but here's my thoughts on it. First of all, we need cheap and efficient 2D and particularly 3D digitization efforts. If we don't do that, we'll keep being stuck at the level of marginal digitization. There's still 80% of everything that needs to be digitized still needs to be digitized and needs to be digitized at higher qualities. So through digitization hubs, open source software departments, we think we might be able to contribute to that. We might be able to contribute that through innovative data storage solutions. There are now people talking about storing petabytes of information on DNA. That is an area of research that is currently gaining ground. So that's one area. Secondly, we need to automate the markup of that data, metadata, content, etc., especially with components of space and time. If you want to create those mirror world components, spatial temporal representation will be key. Handwritten text recognition, indexing and retrieval. We believe that machine learning and artificial intelligence can help us to realize that. We need to connect that. We need to use existing connecting infrastructures. This is where interoperability becomes key. Being able to tie APIs together through smart solutions like IIIF will enable us to bring that data together in one space. And then we see what we call 3 simulation engines. I'm not a technical guy, so here's the non-technical version of that. Large-scale inference engines will chain the 4D information. This 4D simulator will manage possible spatial temporal simulations compatible with the data that you have. And then, if the data is dense enough, you can imagine that you need a lot of data in order to make these things happen. Your universal representation engine will manage 3D representations when the data is available. So then you can get all the effects that I showed you on that picture. So that's finally the experience built on human-computer interactions and visualization becomes as immersive as you need it to be in order to reach school children in the future, scholars, creatives, city planners, and so forth. So that is the stage that we're in. You asked me if there was some room for questions, and I think we've got a little bit. No? Okay. We have plenty of questions that we're struggling with, like, is IIIF currently set up to be able to render time-based media? How does the 4D and the 3D component merge and mesh into that? So I'd be very happy to continue this conversation over the next 2 days, and yeah, thank you very much.